About traditional witchcraft inevitably starts with the question of someone wanting you to define what classes as traditional witchcraft, and most people take quite a partisan approach to this. You've got a very strong polarity from people who believe that there is only one type of traditional craft, which is a type that's come down in a hereditary fashion or through a lineage which involves initiation from one human being to another. Um, and when I first got involved in a form of magic that classed itself as traditional witchcraft, that was the only definition that I had come across. Today, which is 20 years later, now that there's quite a variety of different sort of definitions of what that means. And on the other side of that polarity, you see like what I think has emerged over the past 10 years, the definition that it involves a return to folk magic and to unearthing, often through reconstruction, but also through spirit-led encounters where people have spontaneous experiences with acquiring familiar spirits, in a way that would be recognizable to people in the past that we hear about in witchcraft trial records where people were approached directly by spirits. And on that other polarity, you sort of have a mixture of that. You've got that reconstruction mixed with that personal, direct, ecstatic spiritual experiences. And most people that I know that class themselves as a traditional witch, also sometimes referred to as old craft, tend to fall down very strongly on one side of that or the other. And I don't really want to kick off by saying too much about my position on that, because I think that in a lot of ways there is no definitive answer to that subject. I think it's more important that I position my own personal experience of how I came to be here and writing those books, and you can sort of do with that what you will, I suppose. I first met somebody that was identifying as a traditional witch when I was in my late teens, and that was in Australia. A lot of people who are based in Great Britain are often a bit surprised to hear that that exists at all, that there is actually people claiming a lineage of some sort of form of passage of ongoing in most cases identified as a pre-Wiccan strain of witchcraft. But it is a thing. I mean, obviously, like most people making that claim, the people that I've met, very few of them have what you class as hard proof of that, which is kind of to be expected in many ways, considering that you're talking about a subjective experience passed between people, often under quite secretive conditions. I think it would be the rare group that would have, hard documented evidence. But certainly people that I trust and people that I know personally and have seen, a fair amount of supporting material to suggest it, do appear to possess these practices that have existed in Australia, just as America has its own sort of folkloric magic and divergent practices as people have brought them out from Britain. So yes, I've had contact with a couple of different people of varying degrees of authenticity, in my view, in Australia. And so when I first became involved, I was of the opinion that writing books or coming forward publicly was just not something that traditional witches did, that it was a purely underground thing and always had been. And so I have always been a writer, always been very naturally a writer, but I put my inspiration and my urges to share something about the magic that I do into fiction. And I didn't intend to ever publish something like A Deed Without a Name, but a lot of my friends had sort of pointed out to me that there was a bit of a gap, I suppose, between all of the scholarly material that was coming out, analysing trial records and analysing folklore, and books that actually gave you some idea of how to apply that for people that were having experiences. And I mean, that's the other part of this, is that I didn't just end up there like most people because I met some people. I was looking because these things happened to me. I saw things, I had visitations from what appeared to be spirits of some kind, but no explanation or context for those experiences, which was provided to me via making contact with the craft. And I think that was one of the main reasons that I eventually agreed to write the book itself, was because I thought that there could be other people out there who might also require that context for experiences that they were having. But yes, I one of the big questions that sort of has hung over my head about whether or not to write and to be public and such was that no matter which part of that polarity of definition of traditional craft you believe, it still is a practice that's not for everybody. It's something that you have to be called for in some way. And what I will say about my opinion on what classes as traditional craft is that I do believe that there is a deep importance in the clan-like covenants and coven structures and things like that that form between people in terms of passing witchcraft. I don't believe it is the only way to practice, but I do place a strong importance on it. And I think for that reason I thought to myself, well, what's the point? You know, why share this with people if only so many people can actually have it? Because people will say, well, there's no teacher near me, or there's no initiator near me, and so why tell us about these things that we can't have? And, you know, in a way it does seem almost unkind sometimes when you see some people that have come forward and written something, and then they'll say, well, you know, people will ask, how can I get involved with that? And they'll be like, oh, well, sorry, you can't. And it's a little demoralising. So, and of course also the other conundrum that anybody faces when writing about it is that if you do belong to some kind of tradition, or you have taken oaths, or you have entered into some sort of sodality or coven structure, or even if you were just, you know, born into a family that practiced this sort of thing, there's a lot of discretion that is required, if not outright secrecy around some things. So you can't write about those things. And so the big question is what you can write about meaningfully. And when I was writing my fiction novels, in the series that I've written, which is about people practicing traditional witchcraft, that sort of artistic angle allows you to talk a bit about things that you couldn't otherwise say through that kind of storytelling and poetic medium. And I decided when I was writing that one of the characters was putting together research to try to explain the experiences of the people in his coven, sort of trying to take an academic angle on it. And I thought to myself, well, I should write his book. I should write the book that my character is writing, in a sense. And that's how A Deed Without a Name came to be, because I thought to myself, well, you know, if I can make this a sort of a slightly academic, slightly artistic endeavour, I can find a way to touch on things that, you know, hint at and sort of bring out different themes that I can't just directly say. And, you know, since I've written that, I've got involved in writing quite a lot of things for anthologies with Three Hands Press, where I've been able to go into both of those angles, both of the academic and the artistic angle of things. And I really believe that this brings us to that important question that I was stuck on, and why I couldn't decide whether to write or not to write, which is what purpose this serves for other people. And I think that that's twofold, like in terms of how it benefits other people's lives and how what relevance it has in the modern age. I think there's basically two categories of people. There's the people who this answers a burning question for them, who have seen things or experienced things that fit with the witchcraft mythic structure, the concept of the Sabbath, the concept of out-of-body night flight, the concept of animal transformations, and that sort of substrata of mythic material that is full of a deep archetypical power that for many of us speaks to something in us that we can't fully explain any other way than through associating ourselves with the image of the witch or the mythic figure of the witch. And then you've got your other category of people who are interested and inspired by the material but wouldn't actually class themselves as a witch. And the reason I think that particularly a lot of the artistic approaches such as fiction or music or art which is inspired by witchcraft is very important to people even if they're not witches, because in our collective folk heritage this figure of the witch has always been the ultimate marginalised other figure who is the rejected and upon all of the ills of society have been placed. And most of the witchcraft movement prior to traditional witchcraft becoming more well known has all been about trying to make that figure a little more approachable and a bit of a sanitizing of that in the aim of getting a greater social acceptance for that. And I feel that amongst people that are coming forward now asking for us to reconsider that, asking for us to reconsider whether perhaps some of the edginess and some of the discomfort of the figure of the witch is actually quite important and powerful. I feel that there's a bit of a renaissance of a type happening artistically around, that material. And I think Peter Gray's Apocalyptic Witchcraft is a really good example. Crosses across the imaginary borderline between traditional witchcraft and other types, or at least sort of like occupies a semi-permeable membrane between the two. And there's quite a bit of work like that which is challenging this idea that whether or not we have lost something of the primal power of that image by trying to go for mainstream acceptance. And I think that the other reason that that's deeply important is because we live in a time where, I guess because I'm a writer, I see the world as controlled by narratives very much, that our mindsets are shaped by different power narratives such as capitalism and globalism and progress and all of these big ideas that run our lives. And I feel that through globalism and also through social media and everything like that, that the number of narratives that control our lives are sort of becoming smaller and the options appear a little bit narrower. And I don't know if ever before there has been a time in history where witches, in a quite unsanitized way, have been able to come forward and say, well, actually, no, we're not entirely always warm and cuddly, and some of what we do is quite edgy, and we can say that and we can actually print material about it, and art and fiction and poetry and all of these different things that are aimed at people within that movement, but also other people who are interested. I mean, I know people who are not actually traditional witches or witches of any type do read my fiction just the same way that they might read about vampires or they might read about werewolves. They find the witchcraft themes interesting in and of themselves. And it exposes us to something that makes us step outside the box. It makes us really go to that other side of the hedge and look back into the village and the town within and the ideas that are boxed inside that, and look from a radically different point of view. And, particularly fiction, which is why I keep writing it, even though non-fiction is clearly far more popular, forces us into that empathic space with the other. It makes us see through the eyes of something, someone, person, creature that thinks entirely differently to ourselves. So I think that that's valuable in and of itself, because it also links to how we view nature. And I think that the wildness that the witch figure has, and that primal untamed edge, and that, teeth and claw element to it, is part of the truth about nature. And I think if we can't accept that, we can't accept the wilderness as it truly is, rather than a garden, and the nice sort of soft nature image. Like, wild nature doesn't really care about you. It will take your head off if you let it. And I think that's something in this day and age, where we're shrinking the wilderness as much as we are, that it's important that we come to grips with. And I believe that, this kind of work is relevant for that reason, even to people who may never wish to practice witchcraft, people who may just be very interested in our collective folk heritage, or who may just simply be curious. I've had quite a few really good readers who've come to me and said, I can't even imagine thinking the way your characters do, or having those experiences, but wow, it's so different to anything else that I've read. And I think anything that does that is important. So yes, I'd say in a nutshell, that's the sort of, like, the why this is relevant to me sort of answer to the question, which I think is always important with this sort of thing. What's the point? So I'd just like to say, sort of branch out from there to saying a couple of things about my upcoming book, which hasn't actually been announced, but probably will be this week. It's called Sounds of Infinity, and it's to do with the faerie faith and witchcraft. And I want to touch on it, not just because it's coming out soon and it's topically relevant and everything, but also because I think the topic of faerie is a good one to touch on when trying to discuss traditional craft, because not only do most traditional craft witch houses have some kind of mythos or some kind of story about a link to a faerie founding figure, or some sort of connection to that realm. The good folk are, by their nature, very similar to dealing with traditional craft, in that you're not actually meant to talk about them. If you have an experience with the fae, one of the main prohibitions in folklore was directly passing on that experience. People come back from the realm of faerie similarly in the way that they come back from initiation in the craft, in that there is certain things about which they must hold their tongue. But there's also skills and blessings and gifts that are given in return for that. It's not just like a... and I think this highlights one of the things people get wrong about traditional craft. Like, they believe that people keep secrets for elitist ideas, of like sort of feeling that I've got something you don't have. And in a lot of ways it goes back to a connection to the same reason that you don't speak about things in relation to the fae. Not only is power released whenever words are spoken, so there's a loss of energy, there's a leakage of power from something when it's openly discussed, but also it's my perception, and I would never want to speak for the fae personally, but it is my perception that they don't like to be labelled or pinned down in any way by a specific statement about what their nature is. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the refraining from speech has a lot to do with not having what you do known and boxed in and limited in that manner. There's a sort of amorphous power. It's almost a Schrodinger's cat sort of example of and until it's been spoken of, the potential is open. The potential for a act of magic, or a group sort of egregore of a tradition to have this unformed power behind it, because it remains unspoken and unknown. And you risk that when you write and go into the public eye in any way. You risk certain things through exposure, and I think that with my coming book, the reason that I've written it the way that I have is I've tried to sort of avoid those risks as much as possible by dividing it into a three-part approach of having an academic unpacking of the folklore of the fairy realm, followed by exploring it as storytelling, and then presenting it as grimoire, where people can put into action and find out for themselves. And that's always what I think is important at the end of the day. What I tell you about it is nowhere near as important, and that's, I think, brings us full circle around to why I don't wish to 100% lock down a definition of what traditional craft can or cannot be. I have my own personal leanings and things like that, but I think at the end of the day, in anything that limits your experience of being able to engage directly with the spirit world and to have an experience of magic, I don't think that thing is helping you. Fundamentally, I think it's important that you take whatever you can pick up from my books or anyone else's, and you take them out and you experiment with them. And I know that when it comes to something like the fairy faith and the interaction with the other side, nothing anybody tells you can prepare you for the way that your consciousness can be utterly rearranged. And I think that that's a one of maybe perhaps a third thing that this sort of material can potentially bring you, even if you don't practice it, even just through exposing yourself to the writing or the music or the art of people that have had those encounters. There's something other in that material, something utterly alien, something reconfiguring. And I think that when many of us get into a rut, or we get into habits or depressions or many of the deadening effects of modern life, sometimes what we need is a trip to the wilderness. And it's not just the physical wilderness, but the wilderness inside us. And hopefully any good writing about witchcraft can help to stimulate that wilderness inside us. So I think... Okay, so are there exercises in my fiction specifically that you could use to follow if you wanted to experiment? Definitely. I think if you were canny and cunning enough, you could get many techniques from the fiction. I think you have to put a bit of thought into it, which makes it a bit different to the material in A Deed Without a Name, where it is pretty much laid out for you how to do it. But there's a great deal of material, and I think that's because that's how I prefer to teach. I prefer to offer something in a creative way that's not didactic or telling you this is what you must do, but more inspiring you to experiment. And yes, yeah, I think you could probably get further even with the fiction if you were applying it. Definitely. Okay, is there a wicked side to witchcraft? Yes. Yes, I think that in a nutshell there is, and I think if you even look at it just historically, folklore, trial records, everything like that, there is very definitely a big association with maleficium or negative magic. A lot of it you find as a sort of a power that the common people have, the people that are oppressed, who have nothing else to help themselves with but the possibility of the underdog fighting back with that sort of magic. But also, and I do sort of address these questions a bit in A Deed Without a Name, I think witchcraft has the amoral force of nature behind it. I think it's neither good nor bad. I think it possesses all of the nuances of that, the same as nature. You know, when a lion is taking the head off a gazelle, the gazelle thinks it's wicked, but the lion just thinks it's dinner. And I think that nature is like that, and I think witchcraft is too. But, I mean, obviously, you know, both historically and in terms of modern practice, there's people that often struggle with things like the evil eye, like a sort of an actual involuntary seeming thing that people can experience as this strong current of malefic intention. But I think all this stuff is very complex because, unlike nature, we are humans and we live in a civil society, and we have to work out ways to sort of, I suppose, deal with that without repressing that side of it. Because I think at the moment we do, we've essentially othered witchcraft again. We've taken the bits that we like and we've sanitized it and we've pushed the rest outside. And I think human nature is very complicated, and it has in it like urges and intentions and things that are not wholly socially acceptable. And witchcraft has copped all of them. In some cases, probably unfairly, it's taken a lot of the sort of unconscious and repressed things from the human psyche, and it's all been dumped there. And I think there is a degree of persecution in that, certainly, but I don't think it's 100%. You know, I think earlier in the 20th century, it was very, or mid sort of to later 20th century, it was quite fashionable to claim that witches were essentially harmless herbalists and midwives, and that people had very meanly made up this idea that they did bad things. But I think the truth is more complicated. I don't think it is wicked to its core, but I certainly think it's complex, and different traditions have different ethical practices. Like I know that, you know, some do have an honor code of some sorts, but it's not quite as nice as if it harms none. But there is usually some kind of honor code in traditions anyway. I mean, the lone witch is a different thing because they don't necessarily follow anyone's code, but like a coven usually has some kind of honor code, usually involving not harming the innocent. Don't I? So to paraphrase, would I say that my ritual practice has been strongly affected by those shifts in consciousness with dealing with the fae? As I was going to say, it's difficult to answer that because of the fact that a lot of those kind of dealings are traditionally covered by quite a few taboos about directly explaining them. But I would certainly say that anybody that has had a genuine encounter with the faerie realm is going to be radically changed by it, because you're talking about an entity that doesn't think like we do, that's their entire sort of mindset, for want of a better word, comes from a totally different angle to us. And once that's entered into your psyche in some way, change of a monumental proportion is inevitable. And I think that anyone who's experienced that, their ritual practice would certainly be affected by it.
Yes,
A lot of people do, like, have quite strong opinions on that. I think that once you start getting in the very purest approach of only lineage, only initiation and everything like that, you tend to disappear down a bit of a rabbit hole, because very few traditions can prove their lineage. If you want to start getting that academic kind of level of proof, you know, something that would stand up against Ronald Hutton, for instance, like virtually nobody. There's probably only one tradition that has anything that even amounts to something that would stand up in court. So yeah, it's difficult around that. I think personally there are hallmarks, certainly, I would say, that I would see as important. I think that I think that if you're working traditional craft, that a great deal of the practice is ecstatic and visionary. I think that it tends to be more focused on working with familiar spirits rather than the god and goddess, such as in Wicca. Whilst I must say, as a disclaimer, I'm not initiated into traditional Wicca, so I can't actually say what their internal practices are. But from the outside, it appears that there's a strong focus on the god and goddess. And I think that traditional witchcraft is strongly regional, because there isn't a single body to say what's authentic. It emerged in different locations, and so what emerged in Australia, for instance, after diverging quite some time ago, might have quite a different flavour to something that emerged in America, and even regional differences between counties in the UK, which makes it very difficult to generalise. Though, you know, some people will say that there is more than that. I mean, there's certainly other things that you could say are hallmarks of it. I think most people believe in something that is often referred to as witch blood, which is often misunderstood as being some kind of entirely genetic kind of thing, which it's really not. It's quite a deep concept, really, behind it, and it can be invigorated and passed initiation is adoption in most traditional craft houses that I've had contact with, more so than just getting a grade, like a degree. Like it's more about being adopted into a house, into a family, and at which case you have their blood, so it's not a thing that is only about family lines, but certainly that's a thing that I think is common to most. It's a bit of both. I think that there is genuine edginess, in the sense that I think that there is a certain degree of use of aversion, confrontation, and taboo breaking and things like that, which I think could be seen as edgy. But on the other side, from the perspective of the witch themselves, as opposed to the mainstream looking at the witch, I don't actually view those things as particularly shocking. I don't think that the use of sexuality or sexual imagery is shocking, or that bloodshed is particularly if it happens to be your own, is particularly shocking. These things, these quite primal, like the body as very much part of magic, and the fluids of it, and the body's place in magic, to me that isn't shocking particularly. So I guess in one way I could say that the power structures have projected that through the way that the body has been demonized and sort of controlled so much by the mainstream power structures. I think we have demonized a lot of things that are actually quite natural, and any other animal would consider death and sexuality and all of these processes to be perfectly acceptable things. So yes, it is edgy from the perspective of what mainstream culture would think was edgy, but from my perspective I would say that mainly it's projected onto witchcraft. Does that when you say modern, do you mean like things that are used currently?
Yep.
Well, I could talk about a few that are in the public domain. Sorry, I was meant to repeat the question. Okay, yes, I can give some examples of witchcraft techniques that are used in a modern context. So, commonly known things that go on at Sabbats would involve such things as turning the mill, which is a kind of circular trance-inducing process of moving around a central stang or a central point until a certain state of consciousness is reached. A lot of the processes that go on are to induce trance states, so dance and drumming and things like that are used in very particular ways that different traditions will have their own keys, their own... See, that's why it's hard to generalise about a lot of these things, because whilst I would say that an ecstatic procedure of some kind would go on at most traditional craft rituals, it's going to be different from place to place. You're going to have probably some form of extremity involved in it, whether that be sensory deprivation or just a long period of movement. What are some other good examples? I think, different traditions utilise different mixtures of those more ecstatic, free-form kind of practices with some ceremonial aspects. There does tend to be a degree of like a mystery tradition of some kind that is in most traditions, where there is a walking through in the place of the spirits of that tradition, where you walk through an experience that they have in the story in some way as a way to put you in that state, and often states of possession and things like that follow from that. Um, yeah, magic is quite like various. I think in most traditional craft groups it goes all the way from very small folk magic kind of works, like, you know, simple things that you would have seen in the past, like the hag warding kind of things where people would tie skeleton keys to hagstones to block out nightmares, and all those really small, like, sort of folk magic stuff, through to very large ritual proceedings that aim to bring people to a crossroads state in consciousness where the physical Sabbath becomes one with the timeless Sabbath, which is like a state of ecstasis outside of the body and outside of time and space. Yeah, so I think that, like, my book, the A Deed Without a Name one, has a bunch of practical things that you can do in the back of it. There's, I suppose, also quite a bit of material on folk magic that you can get your hands on probably in all kinds of places, and I think the important part is to do them, rather than they sound simple, but when you actually do them, sometimes they unlock hidden depths, because a practice, and that's something believed, I think, in most old craft circles, is that a simple practice, if understood, the symbolism is understood and walked through, you're not just walking through that alone, but you're walking through that with all the people that have done that practice before you, and that has built up a power and a profundity to it. And I think a lot of people spend a lot of time sort of looking for new information and stuff, when really getting out there and finding even just one really simple folk charm like that and doing it many times and dedicating yourself to it can unlock a lot more than a very ornate ritual. I hope that helped.